It all unfolded on an especially chilly February 1st, 1922. The scene, a luxurious bungalow at 404B South Alvarado Street in Los Angeles. This was just the kind of property that movie-crazed fans used to lurk outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of a star. If anyone had braved the cold that night, they could have spotted not only a star, but the beginning of a Hollywood supernova in scandal terms. It was around 7 p.m. when actor and director William Desmond Taylor welcomed a visitor, his good friend Mabel Normand, who arrived in a powerful and stunningly expensive chauffeur-driven limousine. She would make a short visit to Taylor's home, and then wave goodbye with little idea that she would be one of the last people to see him alive. William Desmond Taylor is iconic in Hollywood history, not for his films, but for his dramatic unsolved murder. The case shocked the nation, and remains cold to this day. The list of suspects included famous names like Mabel Normand, actress Mary Miles Minter, and Minter's own mother. In this video, a special for our 50th episode, we're looking deeply into the incredible life and death of William Desmond Taylor. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Sometimes it takes a person's death to reveal who they truly were. This was certainly the case for William Desmond Taylor. Just days after his murder, the investigation took the first of many a strange turn. Police uncovered that the man everyone knew as William Desmond Taylor was not who he seemed. His real identity was William Cunningham Dean Tanner, born on April 26, 1872, in Carlow, Ireland. Like so many who found themselves drawn to early Hollywood, he was living under a new identity and had decided to leave his entire previous life behind him. Taylor was a mystery even before the fatal day. William was the third child among 5 siblings in a family with a distinguished background. His father, Major Thomas Kearns Dean Tanner, served with the Carlow Rifles, part of the 8th Battalion King's Royal Rifle Corps, in the British Army. His mother, Jane O'Brien, came from a well-to-do Anglo-Irish family, part of Ireland's ruling social class at the time. Away from Carlow, the family also owned property in Dublin, where William spent much of his early childhood. When he reached his teenage years, he tried to follow his father's footsteps into the army, but failed the entrance exams. So, from 1885 to 1887, he attended Marlborough College in England, although some records say he might have gone to Clifton College instead. Either way, he studied at one of England's finest schools. It was here that William first developed an interest in acting. However, his father, as an army man, likely didn't much appreciate his son's keen interest in the stage. So in 1891, he sent William to live on a ranch near Runnymede, Kansas. This was about as far from the London stage as could be, and ought to have dampened his ambitions to become a new Oscar Wilde. However, things turned out very differently. While in the US, Taylor in fact became even more serious about acting and soon quit the ranch and made his way to New York with the intention of finding success on Broadway. On December 7, 1901, William Cunningham Dean Tanner married Ethel May Hamilton at the little church around the corner. Ethel May, known on the stage as Ethel May Harrison, was an actress famous for her role in the Edwardian musical comedy hit Florodora. Marrying Ethel May further raised William's social standing. The two started dealing in antiques, and he likely spent this time sharpening his acting abilities. William became vice president of the English Antique Shop in New York, which was a very successful business owned by his father-in-law. This position allowed the couple to enjoy an affluent lifestyle in fashionable Larchmont. William was well-liked and popular among those who knew him, according to most accounts. Their daughter, Ethel Daisy, was born in 1903. It seemed that he had set himself up for a genteel and comfortable life among New York's fin de siècle high society. But something was going on in the mind of William Dean Tanner, and we can surmise that the prospect of lifelong bourgeois respectability in antique stealing was troubling him. Something was pushing him, perhaps goading him to turn his back on a life of luxury and seek out adventure. The signs had already been apparent. As a man of society, William was a member of several gentlemen's clubs and often availed himself of their services to drink heavily. He also suffered from depression and had several casual affairs. His mental state had been a cause of concern to family and friends for some time, and he was reported as suffering from so-called mental lapses, in which he would experience short-term amnesia. All of this together paints a picture of a very unhappy man. So it was then that in 1908, William Cunningham Dean Tanner turned his back on his New York life without leaving a trace. One day he left for lunch, and he never came back. The following day, he wired the antique shop requesting $600 to be sent to him, which a messenger delivered. After that, he disappeared entirely from New York. No one ever saw or heard from him there again for many years. What happened to him in the following years is not entirely certain. It seems he may have adopted his soon-to-be famous moniker of William Desmond Taylor at this point and made his way to Canada, Alaska, Colorado, and Montana following the gold rush. He was able to use his experience as an engineer on the ranch to get involved in mining activities in these regions. But little else is known of his life during this period, other than the fact he combined mining with developing his acting skills by performing with many troupes while on the road. After 4 years without any word from him, Ethel filed for divorce from William in 1912 so she could marry again. The divorce records give his whereabouts as residence unknown, but later that same year, William reappeared, this time at Innsville, a bustling movie set village along the coast near Santa Monica. Created by film pioneer Thomas H. Ince, a man who would become embroiled in his own scandalous mystery some years later. Taylor had arrived there through some actors he knew from New York that he had crossed paths with in San Francisco. They urged him to join the exciting new film industry. That was taking shape in Los Angeles at the time. These friends gave him money to make the move, from which we can deduce his gold rush activities had not brought him the riches he had hoped for. However, it would be the silver rush, the silver screen rush, that is, that would strike a fortune for Taylor. After making a good impression at Innsville, William was hired by the New York Motion Picture Company, a powerhouse that ran multiple brands like Keystone, KB, Bronco, and Reliance. This company, along with others, would eventually help lay the foundation for Paramount Studios. His first role with them was in a film called The Counterfeiters, though there isn't much information available about this picture. Shortly after, in 1913, he appeared in KB Studios' production of The Iconoclast. During breaks on set, Taylor spent his time observing every part of the filmmaking process, or reading. His dedication was clear. He wasn't one to chat casually with others unless necessary, and he was a highly educated man devoted to self-education. He went on to act in several films for Vitagraph Studios, including 4 with actress Margaret Gibby Gibson, a lot more on her later, and continued working with the Balboa Amusement Producing Company. Actress Neva Gerber, whom he was engaged to until 1919, later described him as the soul of honor, a man of personal culture, education, and refinement. I have never known a finer or better man. In 1914, he began his directing career with The Judge's Wife for Balboa. He soon moved on, directing 2 films for Favorite Players Film Co., and then joined American Film Manufacturing Company, where he directed much of the 30-episode serial, The Diamond from the Sky. However, his big break would not come as a director, but playing the title role in Captain Alvarez, directed by Roland S. Sturgeon, and starring Edith Story as the leading lady. The film was a smash hit and shot Taylor to movie fame and a huge bump in his earnings. Curiously enough, this film tells the story of Robert Wainwright, a man who heads to the Argentine Republic to manage his father's business. However, the nation is in the grip of a revolution, and events conspire to lead Wainwright to change to a new identity, Captain Alvarez, and become a heroic rebel leader. Taylor was widely praised for how convincing he was in this role, a fact which may not be too surprising given his real-life circumstances. However, this film's success would prove a double-edged sword for Taylor, as its popularity would later have consequences for his new life. Around 1915, Taylor reconnected with his sister-in-law, Ada Brennan Dean Tanner, the wife of his younger brother, Dennis. Dennis, who had been a British Army lieutenant and, like Taylor, managed a different antiques business in New York, had also vanished in 1912, leaving Ada and their children behind. Ada, now living in Monrovia, California, had moved there for tuberculosis treatment at the Pottinger Sanatorium, where her sister Lillian's husband, Dr. John L. Pomeroy, was in charge. This family connection would later become public, following Taylor's murder, and a huge media circus would descend on Monrovia. Taylor continued working steadily in Hollywood, both acting and directing. In 1917, he was cast in A Tale of Two Cities, where his background in art and literature proved invaluable to director Frank Lloyd. Taylor also quickly gained a reputation as an accomplished, cultured director, rising to a top position at Famous Players Lasky. He directed some of the biggest actors of the era like Dustin Farnham, George Beban, Kathleen Williams, and Constance Talmadge, handling major projects like 1917's Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn in 1920. As his fame grew, so did his popularity with women. His good looks and success as a director attracted plenty of attention, and he was in a position to help many aspiring actresses. However, the U.S. soon entered World War I, disrupting Hollywood like everywhere else. In July 1918, at age 46, Taylor enlisted in the Canadian Army, though he wasn't deployed before the war ended. He served with the peacekeeping force in France until his discharge in mid-1919. It's also worth noting here that his early co-star, Edith Story, went directly to the front lines, becoming one of the first American women to drive ambulances in France and Belgium, a dangerous and commendable role. Upon his return, Taylor directed Anne of Green Gables in 1919. This film featured his protégée Mary Miles Minter, an actress whose name would soon become closely linked to the dark and complex mystery that would unfold only a few years later. Meanwhile, back in New York, his ex-wife Ethel took their daughter Ethel Daisy to the movies to see a picture that had made its way to New York after gaining a reputation as one of the most exciting to come out of Hollywood in the last few years. It was, of course, Captain Alvarez. This was still 10 years before popcorn became a popular movie tradition, but if Ethel had been holding any, she surely would have dropped it in shock when she saw her former husband up on the screen, now one of Hollywood's biggest stars. She turned to her daughter and said, "That's your father." When she got home, Ethel Daisy wrote to her father, care of the studio, and he went to New York to visit her and then formally made Ethel Daisy his legal heir in 1921. After that, father and daughter rebuilt their relationship and had a close bond. One of Taylor's final projects was directing Betty Compson in 1922's The Green Temptation. But he would not live to see the premiere of this film, which is now lost. Now we return to the murky events of February 1st, 1922, and the evening visit that Taylor received from his friend, actress Mabel Normand. Taylor and Normand had known each other since 1920. They grew close during a difficult period in her life. They bonded over their shared love of literature. Taylor became a source of stability for a struggling Normand. When her life spiraled into heavy drug use and constant partying, he was the one who urged her to seek help at a sanatorium. Her cocaine addiction and excessive drinking had left her burned out, and friends feared she was on a dangerous path. The recent tragic death of actress Olive Thomas had shaken Normand, who worried she might face a similar fate. Taylor's intervention that autumn likely saved her life, and if you want to hear about Olive, feel free to rewind all the way back to Hollywood Mysteries Episode 2, which is linked on screen now and in the description below. That night, being a Wednesday with early starts the next day, they didn't plan to stay up too late. The two friends enjoyed Orange Blossom gin cocktails, played piano for a little, and talked about things they both loved, like movies and the works of Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud. Taylor had promised her a book, which she picked up before leaving. He also told her his latest news. That morning, he had to bail his valet, Henry Peavy, out of jail. Peavy had been arrested in a public park the previous night for lewd conduct. Around 7:45 p.m., Mabel said her goodbyes, and Taylor walked her to her waiting car. As she climbed into her limousine, he likely didn't bother to lock or even close the front door of his bungalow. They exchanged blown kisses as her car drove away, and Taylor returned inside. Besides the person who would take his life, Mabel Normand was the last person to see William Desmond Taylor alive. Just before 8 p.m., Faith Cole McLean, who was married to actor Douglas McLean and had acted herself, was knitting on her porch when a loud noise made her jump. Several neighbors heard it too, but most assumed it was just a car backfiring. Looking over at Taylor's bungalow, Faith noticed a short, stocky figure who looked, as she put it, like my idea of a motion picture burglar. The person wore a long coat, a muffler or turned-up collar, and a flat cap that obscured much of the face. Faith testified that the figure met her gaze briefly before calmly turning and heading back inside, as if returning for something forgotten. Douglas MacLean described the stranger as funny-looking, with an effeminate walk, and in a 1932 testimony, Faith admitted she wasn't sure if it was a man or a woman. From that point, the mysterious figure disappeared into the night, having perhaps slipped into the home while Taylor was distracted saying his goodbyes to Normand. The next morning at 7:30, a scene of chaos erupted at the Alvarado Court complex. Taylor's valet, Henry Peavy, was beside himself, screaming, "Mr. Taylor is dead! Mr. Taylor is dead!" Peavy had discovered Taylor lying face down and lifeless on the floor of his study upon arriving for his day's work. Soon a crowd gathered as Peavy, instead of calling the police, notified the studio, leading to a procession of Paramount representatives and curious neighbors. Eventually, someone thought to call the police, who joined the growing crowd. Before officers arrived, Paramount employees moved quickly to clean up the scene. They removed a wire basket full of letters and swept the bungalow for anything potentially incriminating, including bottles of bootleg liquor. They then instructed Peavy to rearrange the furniture, clear the blood, and scrub the crime scene. Despite their efforts, they overlooked a stash of letters that Taylor had hidden in his riding boots. As Taylor's body lay in a pool of blood, the onlookers speculated about the cause of death. One neighbor believed he died from a stomach hemorrhage, but when the police finally arrived and rolled the body over, the truth was plain. A single bullet had pierced his lung, traveled upward through his body, exited and re-entered through the neck, ending his life. He had been shot in the back. The shock of Taylor's murder sent Paramount Pictures and the film industry into a frenzy. Taylor was a respected figure, known for his eloquence and clean reputation, with 60 films to his name. Unlike others in Hollywood, he had managed to avoid scandal. Yet his death came at a time when the industry was under intense scrutiny. Hollywood was still reeling from the recent deaths of stars like Wally Reed and Olive Thomas, and activists, including a group led by Reed's widow, were protesting content they deemed corruptive and the behavior of young stars they considered immoral. Hollywood had come to be viewed as a primary threat to American values, with voices from all sides, progressive and conservative, demanding reform to protect the country's youth. The same groups that pushed for prohibition were now setting their sights on Hollywood, aiming to reform or even dismantle it. In response, Hollywood considered establishing a censorship office to keep those critics at bay, and they saw Taylor as the ideal candidate for chief censor. They hoped that under his guidance, they could continue making films with minimal restrictions. However, Taylor's murder shattered those plans and triggered a series of scandals that would ultimately lead to the restrictive Hollywood production code. But what secrets came to light after his death? Mabel Normand's connection to the case certainly raised questions, but it was the young actress Mary Miles Minter who became the center of media attention. At the time of Taylor's death, Mary Miles Minter was just 20, though she was already an experienced performer. Born Juliette Riley in 1902 to actress Charlotte Shelby, Mary got her start on stage at age 5. By 10, she was cast in a touring production, but due to child labor laws, she was prohibited from continuing. So her mother borrowed the identity of her daughter's deceased cousin, Mary. From that point on, Juliette became Mary, now officially 12 years old. At 15, Mary allegedly had an affair with her much older director, James Kirkwood Sr., and was rumored to have become pregnant. Her mother, who had a tight grip on Mary's career, reportedly arranged for an abortion, and, understandably, became more protective afterward. But her protective instincts were perhaps bordering on unhinged. Mary began working with William Desmond Taylor. Between 1919 and 1920, she and Taylor collaborated on 4 films. Taylor became an advocate for Mary's career, and she in turn fell deeply in love with him. She told him her feelings in numerous love letters. After Taylor's murder, these letters were leaked to the press, which published many in full. Though there was no evidence that Taylor returned her affections or acted on her feelings, The media speculated that the two had been romantically involved, going so far as to imply the relationship had started when she was only 17 and Taylor was 47. Although the letters that surfaced were fairly innocent, they certainly hinted at strong physical attraction on Mary's side. Paramount likely destroyed anything more suggestive that they found at the crime scene, or so one might assume. But Paramount began to see this as something of an opportunity not to be wasted. Further fueling the scandal, a lace handkerchief embroidered with Mary's initials, a triple M, was found in Taylor's home. Additionally, there were rumors about a pink nightgown that supposedly had her initials, though it was never recovered. Mary even offered a $1,000 reward for anyone who could produce this mysterious gown, but it never appeared. It later emerged that Paramount might have intentionally leaked Mary's letters, possibly to shift attention away from even darker rumors about Taylor. These included reports that Taylor had been seen visiting opium dens, which the studio passed off as research. It could have been part of the Taylor's vigilante crusade against Hollywood's drug culture, or perhaps he was a user himself while all the while campaigning for a cleanup. In the era of Prohibition, stranger things than this certainly occurred at a political level. There were also whispers that he had been spotted in gay bars, a potential scandal Paramount seemed desperate to cover up. In what seems like an odd twist, Paramount then spread a rumor that Taylor had a large collection of women's lingerie, with the implication being that he was a ladies' man. The studio appeared paranoid that his reputation might suggest he was bisexual, whether true or not, and they were determined to leave no room for speculation. In any case, they may not have been entirely paranoid. By 1922, Taylor had developed a close connection with a young set designer named George Hopkins, who had worked with him on The Soul of Youth. At Taylor's funeral, Hopkins sat near Mabel Normand, who was weeping throughout. After Taylor's death, several of his friends confirmed that Hopkins and Taylor had indeed been romantically involved. Hopkins, who was openly gay and worked behind the scenes, faced little risk in revealing this. Remarkably, he was also reportedly the principal Paramount employee who had been sent to retrieve Taylor's basket of letters on the morning his body was found. Hopkins would go on to have a celebrated Hollywood career, designing sets until the mid-1970s, and winning 4 Oscars. His memories of Taylor had a prominent place in a book about his life, which was published in 1980. Mary Miles Minter, meanwhile, frequently snuck out of her mother's home at night, heading to Taylor's apartment to wake him. But all evidence suggests that Taylor was not interested in her advances, and was even troubled by her intense infatuation. Ed C. King, a special investigator for the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, concluded that Taylor was trying his best to discourage her. Years later, King shared his findings in True Detective magazine. Here's what he wrote. Taylor swore Hoyt to secrecy, saying that if he would promise not to breathe it to a living soul, he would tell him something that was causing him a great deal of worry. Mr. Taylor then told Mr. Hoyt that the dearest, sweetest little girl in the world was in love with him, and that he was old enough to be her father. This little girl was madly in love with him, had been to his apartment the night before, coming at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. She had insisted on remaining. He had insisted on her going home, whereupon this little girl had cried and threatened that if he tried to put her out, she would scream and cause a scene. In the aftermath of Taylor's death, Mary did cause quite a scene. Kenneth Anger's Hollywood Babylon recounts a typically ludicrous version where she leaned over Taylor's coffin, claiming his spirit whispered his love for her. Though this is probably completely false, Mary did react dramatically when she heard of his murder. Reportedly, she demanded that a doctor take her own blood and infuse it into Taylor in an attempt to bring him back. This idea was only abandoned when she was brought to view Taylor's body in person. Meanwhile, the press was in a frenzy about Minter's possible role in Taylor's death. Police found 3 long blonde hairs on Taylor's jacket, which they matched to Mary's hair by comparing them with strands from her studio hairbrush. Since Taylor was known to have his jacket brushed daily, any hairs on it seemed significant as they would imply recent physical contact. There were also conflicting accounts of whether Taylor and Mary merely waved to each other or stopped and spoke when their cars crossed paths on the day of his death. If they had hugged, this could explain the hairs on his jacket. Much of the circumstantial evidence continued to point toward Mary. Writer Charles Hyam in Murder in Hollywood solving a silent screen mystery, speculated that the backfire sound heard by Taylor's neighbor that night might have been exactly that, a backfire from a visitor's car. Hyam suggested that the mysterious visitor was someone Taylor dismissed quickly to get back to his work on taxes, possibly his own brother. According to this theory, Mary later visited him, once again declaring her love and threatening either to harm him or herself. Hyam proposed that Taylor hugged her to calm her, and in the process the gun discharged accidentally. The positioning of Taylor's wound adds to the mystery. The bullet holes in his jacket and vest didn't align, and powder burns showed that the gun was fired at close range with his left arm raised, as if embracing someone. The height of the shooter would have been a little over 5 feet, which would match up with all the female suspects. Or alternatively, someone who would have had to crouch to shoot from the correct angle. In the weeks that followed, speculation ran wild. Reporters crafted a story of a love triangle between Taylor, Mary, and her mother, Charlotte. What if, they asked, Charlotte had discovered that Taylor was seeing both mother and daughter? It was later revealed that Charlotte owned a .38 caliber pistol, the same type used to kill Taylor. Mary also had access to this gun, and a 1920 incident really threw fuel on the fire when it was uncovered by reporters. During a tantrum, Mary had locked herself in her room with Charlotte's gun, fired a few shots, and then played dead as a dark prank on her family. Hyam believed Mary might have tried to use the gun to manipulate Taylor, much as she had with her family. Investigators later found an unfired soft-nosed bullet hidden in the rafters of the Shelby family home. This bullet matched the type and weight of the one taken from Taylor's body, according to Detective Lieutenant Sanderson, who testified to this in 1937. Yet there was a major flaw in the theory that Mary had visited Taylor and shot him that night. None of the neighbors reported hearing a gunshot in the dead of night. Given the earlier disturbance, it seemed likely they would have been alert to any sudden loud noises in the night. On the other hand, early estimates of Taylor's time of death, based on the absence of rigor mortis when he was discovered, did suggest he may have died between 1 and 2 a.m. This brings us to the next major suspect in Taylor's murder. Director King Vidor, a close friend and colleague of Taylor, became deeply invested in solving the case, and he believed Charlotte Shelby might be responsible. The theory is that Shelby, disguised as a man, slipped into Taylor's bungalow, found Mary there, and shot Taylor in a rage. Charlotte Shelby was an extremely possessive mother figure, living vicariously through her daughter after failing to become an actress herself. Instead, she channeled her ambitions into Mary, who began acting at a young age. It wasn't merely pride that drove her. Mary was a huge investment who was, in the eyes of her mother, set to pay off in a big way if she made her name in Hollywood. After finding out about the affair with James Kirkwood, Shelby, furious, paid for an abortion and is said to have threatened Kirkwood with a .38 revolver. During the filming of A Cumberland Romance, Shelby also reportedly burst into Mary's dressing room with a revolver in hand, catching her daughter in an embrace with actor Monty Blue. Blue quickly exited, and Shelby took Mary home. Later, Shelby allegedly stormed into Taylor's office, shouting, "If I ever catch you hanging around Mary again, I'll blow your goddamn brains out." As far as foreshadowing goes, it doesn't get much more on the nose than that. One night in 1920, Shelby also apparently appeared at Taylor's bungalow, supposedly carrying her 1912 .38 Smith & Wesson revolver hidden in her sleeve, demanding to know if Mary was there. Taylor, fortunately for him, informed her that Mary was not there. Somehow, and it has to be said, miraculously, Shelby wasn't formally questioned in the Taylor case until 1937. This development came from a civil dispute with her other daughter, Margaret Fillmore, who testified, "I protected her against the Taylor murder case." This statement launched a grand jury inquiry, during which Fillmore claimed Shelby was not at home the night of the murder and was worried Mary would elope with Taylor. Astonishingly, Shelby herself had called for the inquiry, hoping to clear her name after her daughter's accusations. This was either a person very confident of their innocence, or one who liked to play a very high-stakes hand, possibly with some cards up her sleeve. Shelby's main alibi for the night of Taylor's murder was actor Carl Stockdale. According to Hyam's research, Stockdale allegedly received a lifetime monthly income for claiming he was with Shelby from 7:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. Shelby's mother, Julia Miles, reportedly disposed of the revolver by throwing it into a bayou near their Louisiana plantation in August 1922. King Vidor revealed that the revolver was later retrieved from the bayou. In 1926, District Attorney Asa Keyes questioned Mary Miles Minter about whether she had ever heard her mother threaten Taylor's life. Mary's response certainly hinted at her mother's volatile temper. Not definitely. She may have said, "I'll kill him. I'll kill him." She was like that. She was always going to kill somebody. Whether Mary or her mother had a direct hand in Taylor's death or not, the scandal surrounding the murder destroyed Mary Miles Minter's career. As she moved from child roles into young adult characters, Hollywood had been positioning her as America's sweetheart, a second coming of Mary Pickford. However, the press quickly shifted this image, painting her as more of a controversial, murderous Lolita. Mary appeared in just 4 more films before her contract expired in 1923. After being dropped by Paramount, Mary received several offers to revive her career, as the studios began to realize that there was no such thing as bad publicity. But she declined them all, as acting had never been her true passion. In 1957, she married Danish-American businessman Brandon O'Hildebrandt, and she spent the rest of her life away from Hollywood. She passed away in Santa Monica on August 4th, 1984, never having fully removed herself from the veil of suspicion concerning the murder of William Desmond Taylor. Mabel Normand, though never a primary suspect, found herself raked over the coals for different reasons, and the impact on her career was similarly devastating. Her actions following Taylor's death, particularly her immediate insistence on retrieving letters she had sent him, seemed somewhat unusual to many. Mabel had something to hide, but it wasn't immediately clear what that something was. The investigation threw a spotlight on Mabel's chaotic and very often troubled life. She was well known for her love of late-night parties and heavy drinking, and she had been in the public eye for her wild lifestyle for a long time. Rumors were also on the loose that claimed she and Taylor might have been romantically involved, especially as she'd recently split from director Max Sennett. But if they were lovers, the idea Mabel was as besotted with Taylor as Mary didn't cut it with anyone. The theory about her involvement was more indirect. The idea was that a vengeful drug dealer may have targeted Taylor. Reports even suggested that Taylor had gone further than merely encouraging Mabel to check into a sanatorium and kick her drug dependency. It is said he chased away her suppliers, and this was a major problem for Mabel's dealers. Before Taylor's intervention, Mabel's bills for opium and cocaine reportedly hit $2,000 a month, equivalent to nearly $40,000 today, a serious income loss for a supplier. Hollywood rumors also claimed Taylor had decided to expose several dealers who had supplied Mabel and was determined to protect her on a well-intentioned but very dangerous crusade. At the time, Hollywood was no stranger to violence, with figures like Vito DiGiorgio of the LA Mafia and the politically well-connected gangster Albert Marco operating in the area. Taylor's actions would have put him at serious personal risk. With Mabel portrayed in the press as a reckless party girl, with alleged ties to dangerous individuals and drug use, her career never recovered. Her health declined and she passed away in her 30s due to tuberculosis. Reportedly, one of her final thoughts was, "I wonder who killed poor Bill Taylor." Henry Peavy, who had been hired as Taylor's cook and valet about 6 months before the murder, replaced a rather suspicious character named Edward Sands. Sands, originally Edward Snyder from Ohio, had a questionable past to say the least. He started as a teenage thief, became a sailor, and later served in the Coast Guard. By the time he showed up in Hollywood, Sands had already abandoned his Coast Guard post, hoping for something a little more glamorous. As Taylor's cook and valet, Sands adopted a British Cockney accent and used his new alias, claiming to be a trained English valet. In truth, Sands had deserted from the Navy, re-enlisted under different names, and faced charges of fraud and embezzlement. He had been dishonorably discharged in 1916 after a year of hard labor, only to re-enlist in 1917, where he promptly stole and wrecked a car. After escaping punishment, he enlisted yet again in 1919 and worked in the finance office, where he forged a check for nearly $500 and falsified his own discharge papers. In 1921, while Taylor was away, Sands took off with some of Taylor's belongings, including suits, a car, and his checkbook. He even pawned jewelry and indulged in Taylor's expensive gold-tipped cigarettes. Sands seemed to be in cahoots with Taylor's driver, and he told the driver he knew things about Taylor that would keep him safe from any serious consequences. When Taylor returned, he fired Sands and the driver. Sands retaliated by sending Taylor a pawn ticket under Taylor's original name, William C. Dean Tanner, along with a mocking note that read, "So sorry to inconvenience you even temporarily. Also observe the lesson of the forced sale of assets. A Merry Christmas, and a happy and prosperous New Year, alias Jimmy V." A handwriting analysis confirmed it was from Sands, and it was clear he knew Taylor's real name and his hidden past. Some even speculated Sands might have been Taylor's estranged brother, Dennis, though that theory lacks much solid evidence. In any case, it seems Sands was a careful plotter who knew how to play the long game. Or alternatively, had had some form of mental collapse during his time working for Taylor. A friend of Taylor's, Julia Crawford Ivers, later recalled that there never was a more devoted man serving another than this man Sands during the first year and a half of his service for Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor trusted him with everything. Sands read everything he could find. He used to study into the late hours of the night, and when Mr. Taylor told me of the various actions attributed to Sands, we all decided the man must have become deranged. In the weeks before his death, Taylor was troubled by a series of late-night phone calls, where the caller would hang up without speaking. The night before the murder, he showed his tax preparer, Marjorie Berger, $5,000 in cash he kept on hand. That money was missing after his death, though $78 and a diamond ring remained on his body, with no other valuables taken. On the day of Taylor's murder, Sands was working at a lumber yard in Oakland, California, but abruptly quit that day, vanishing without a trace. Despite Paramount offering a huge reward for his capture, hoping it would divert attention from other scandals, Sands was never found. Suspiciously, Taylor had never made much effort to track Sands down after their fallout, and Taylor was almost broke at the time of his death, an odd fact given his high salary and relatively minimal spending habits, by Hollywood standards at least. This detail had led many to believe Sands was blackmailing Taylor. Years later, rumors surfaced that Sands was found dead in Connecticut from an apparent suicide. Supposedly, District Attorney Thomas Lee Woolwine knew about this but concealed it to keep the press focused on suspects in Hollywood. Woolwine allegedly continued a manhunt for a man who was already dead. There were also allegations that Shelby had influential ties to Woolwine, which might explain why Mary Miles Minter, or her mother, were never prosecuted. Speculation grew that she may have paid not only Woolwine but also his successors, District Attorneys Asa Keyes, who was later convicted of bribery in another case, and possibly Burren Fitz, who faced bribery and perjury charges in 1934. In one dispute, it emerged that the Shelby Minter family had around $750,000 that went undeclared to the IRS. Starting in 1922, large sums were reportedly converted to bonds and stocks without a paper trail. During litigation in 1931, Shelby's accountant, Les Henry, claimed that much of this money was used for police and press protection. While Henry was convicted of financial misconduct, he wasn't charged with stealing the money. Also, Woolwine received contributions from Paramount during his campaigns, and some say afterward, which could explain his reluctance to pursue certain suspects. Several detectives on the case said they faced blocks whenever they got close to solving it. Director King Vidor recounted in 1968 that retired detective William Michael Cahill Sr., who worked the case from the beginning, once told him, "We were doing all right, and then, before a week was out, we got the word to lay off." Henry Peavy, Taylor's valet, had his own eccentricities, and some were rather more concerning than his habit of wearing full golfing attire, despite never having set foot on a golf course. On the morning Taylor's body was found, Peavy had just been released after an arrest for social vagrancy and lewd and dissolute behavior, charges that could range from public urination to possibly something of a more sexual nature. After an intense interrogation, the police ruled out Peavy as a suspect. However, Floribel Muir, a reporter from the New York Daily News, became convinced he was guilty. In an attempt to get a confession, Muir decided to play on what she assumed was Peavy's fear of ghosts, a fact she based on a bizarre trope in movies of the time that reinforced the idea that Black people were especially afraid of ghosts. She enlisted two friends, Frank Carson and Al Wainshank, to help stage a spooky encounter. They offered Peavy $10 to visit Taylor's grave at the Hollywood Park Cemetery, where Wainshank had arrived earlier and hidden behind a tombstone, draped in a white sheet. When Peavy arrived, Wainshank jumped out, shouting, "I am the ghost of William Desmond Taylor. You murdered me. Confess, Peavy." Peavy, however, laughed at the whole setup, cursing Muir and her friends. Unbeknownst to Muir, Taylor had a distinctive British accent, which Wainshank, who spoke like a Chicago hoodlum, utterly failed to mimic. Wainshank would later become infamous as one of the mobsters gunned down in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. In 1931, Peavy passed away in a San Francisco asylum, suffering from syphilis-related dementia. The last suspect in this tangled case was actress Margaret Gibson, who, as I mentioned earlier, briefly worked with Taylor at Vitagraph Pictures. Her career initially seemed promising, moving from bit parts to leading roles. But in 1917, she was arrested for allegedly selling opium in a park. She avoided prosecution by claiming she was simply doing research for a role, which she euphemistically called gathering local color. Though she escaped conviction, the scandal effectively ended her chances of becoming a major star. Gibson continued to act in smaller roles under several pseudonyms, with Patricia Palmer being her most famous alias. In 1923, Gibson's troubles continued when she was charged in connection with the blackmail and extortion ring that had reportedly swindled millions from wealthy businessmen. One case involved George W. Lasher, who paid Gibson over $1,100 to cover up a supposed violation of the Mann Act, which dealt with transporting minors across state lines for immoral purposes. She was also linked to a pair of men arrested for extorting $10,000 from Ohio bank president John Bushnell. Though she escaped jail time, Gibson's career dwindled to occasional bit parts. In 1929, she left Hollywood entirely, relocating to Singapore where she met and married an oil executive. After her husband was killed in a Japanese bombing raid, Gibson returned to Los Angeles in the early 1940s. Back in LA, Gibson lived quietly, using the name Pat Lewis. She resided in a modest home with only her cat, Raja, for company. She kept to herself, letting her garden overgrow to block the view of passersby, and rarely left her house, fearful of running into anyone who might recognize her, as unlikely as that was by that time. On October 21, 1964, Margaret Gibson suffered a heart attack. Feeling that her time was near, and as a Catholic convert, she asked her neighbors to summon a priest. When no priest was available, Gibson made her own deathbed confession. She claimed that she had once been a silent film actress, and that she was the one who had shot and killed a man named William Desmond Taylor. Her neighbors, not recognizing the name, didn't grasp the weight of her words. It's believed that Gibson's memory had been stirred by watching an episode of Ralph Story's Los Angeles at a neighbor's house shortly before her heart attack. The episode had featured the Taylor murder, causing Gibson to become highly distressed as she remembered the long-buried incident. Her last confession may have been an attempt to make peace with her past, though as with many deathbed confessions, its reliability remains highly questionable. So since then, many have pondered whether her past involvement with the blackmail ring might have been linked to the murder, especially given that it seems that Taylor was being blackmailed by at least one person. Alternatively, many also think she could have killed him in a crime of passion. They certainly would have had ample opportunity to run into one another on the Paramount lot, where she was present in 1921 as Patricia Palmer. The investigation into Taylor's murder was marred by poor handling of evidence and possibly corruption. Key pieces of evidence were lost immediately, and the remaining traces vanished over time. In 2007, copies of a few documents from the original police files were finally made public, but no new evidence surfaced. Numerous theories and books have claimed to solve the case, yet no definitive proof has ever been found to implicate any one person. In the weeks following the murder, public opinion against Hollywood hit a fever pitch. Editorials compared the city's morals to those of ancient Rome under emperors like Caligula and Nero, branding Hollywood as an American Sodom and Gomorrah, and demanding its destruction. Some painted Taylor as a dark, sophisticated villain who got what was coming to him, while others called for every weapon available to uncover the truth and what they saw as a conspiracy to cover up his death. To this day, William Desmond Taylor's murder remains an unsolved chapter in Hollywood history. What was supposed to be a glamorous new world where money, art, and beauty combined to pave the way to an uplifting new century had turned into a violent, corrupt, and terrifying nightmare, at least according to the press. Hollywood was not only chewing up young starlets, but sophisticated, educated, and gifted middle-aged men like William Desmond Taylor. In short, no one was safe from the destructive power of Hollywood. But as we know, it was already an unstoppable force. This episode is something of a special one, as it is not only our 50th episode, but also the very first to be brought to you by one of our fantastic patrons over on Patreon. Our supporter, Dina DiMabro, has been a top-tier patron for a while now, and one of the perks of joining that tier is that after 3 months of membership, you can request a Hollywood Mysteries video on any historical Hollywood figure of your choice. We were delighted Dina picked this amazing story, and even more so because Dina is a fantastic author herself on the history of Hollywood. Her book, True Hollywood Noir, Filmland Mysteries and Murders, formed the main basis of our research for this episode. It is beautifully written, meticulously researched, and has another 11 chapters aside from William Desmond Taylor. Needless to say, it comes with our highest recommendation, and we've put a link in the description for those of you who would like to pick up a copy. It deserves to be a bestseller. We'd like to thank Dina and all of our Patreon supporters. We have a lot of ideas for improving and growing Hollywood mysteries, and you guys are making them possible. If you'd like to sign up to our Patreon or become a YouTube member, the links are in the description, and you can check out our various tiers there, starting from $1 a month. That's all from me. Until next Saturday, sweet dreams.